Hello. Tonight we will quietly step into the cold corridors of Tudor England, where the flickering candles and the deep red velvet curtains only conceal secrets that are far darker. Imagine a king whose cravings were not only for power or glory, but also for desires so intense that queens lost their heads. The church was torn apart, and ghosts were left wandering the palaces even to this day. This is certainly not a bedtime story for children, unless you want them never to sleep again. And to be honest, even you will find it hard to survive all the way through this story. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And by the way, leave a comment to let me know where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. I really love seeing how far these late-night journeys travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Close your eyes. Take a deep breath. And imagine yourself standing in a vast hall of Hampton Court Palace. The ceiling soars high. The heavy tapestries carry the scent of damp wood and candle smoke. Each of your footsteps echoes like a rhythm knocking on history. And at the end of that corridor, the figure of a giant king gradually appears. That is Henry VIII, the man who not only shook the entire European church, but also turned his own bedroom into a private parliament, where the fate of a queen could be decided with just a glance. You see, there are few places in history where the bed was as important as the throne. Let me pull you back to the year 1509. At that time, Henry was only 17 years old, ascending the throne after the sudden death of his brother and father. People described him as the Golden Prince, tall, strong, riding horses like the wind, playing music and singing no less than Italian artists, and showing off his jousting skills before thousands of admirers. You might think, a young man like that would surely be the ideal match on Tinder if he lived today. But sorry, if you swipe right on Henry, your account might disappear at the same time as your head. An important historical event here: Henry married Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess, widow of his brother. That marriage was specially permitted by the Pope, but this very dispensation later became the spark that ignited one of the greatest religious crises in Europe. Catherine was gentle, intelligent, patient to the point of being respected by the English people as a living saint. Yet, for Henry, this love was only strong until she could no longer bear a surviving son. Historians still debate whether Catherine was truly the wife Henry loved most, or if that love was only the fleeting glory of youth. While Catherine struggled with repeated failed pregnancies, Henry frequently appeared alongside other young faces at court. A strange fact that few notice: Henry once had a son with Elizabeth Blount, a young lady in waiting, and the boy was openly acknowledged. Something very rare in European dynasties. That child was given the title Duke of Richmond, as if Henry wanted the whole world to know that the problem did not lie with him. You could say this was the ancient version of a public Facebook check-in to prove he was still working fine. Truly a PR method from the past, but no less effective. Just imagine, in a strictly Catholic society, where marriage was considered sacred, a king openly having an illegitimate child was both shocking and fascinating. It turned the court into a dramatic stage, where every glance, every smile of the young women could be interpreted as an unofficial job application for the position of the favored one. And even worse, no one dared refuse. Henry was not someone good at keeping his private affairs hidden. If the French kings skillfully concealed their mistresses, Henry preferred to display them. He even paraded his lovers right in front of the Queen. Just think about it. Like you going out for dinner, and your ex is sitting at the table right across from you. But the difference is, you cannot get angry. You cannot leave, because the one doing it is the king. A power game, both cruel and humiliating. Then, when Mary Boleyn appeared, Anne Boleyn's sister, the story took another turn. Mary was seen as a discreet lover, with little ambition. There were rumours she bore Henry at least one child, but he never acknowledged it. When the relationship faded, Mary was married off like a spare pawn, like an old object. You see, to Henry, women were not people, but just pieces in the game of politics and personal ambition. But Mary was only the prelude. When Anne Boleyn entered, everything exploded. Unlike her sister, Anne refused to be a mistress, even dangling Henry for 7 years. And the result was that the hot-tempered king dared to cut off relations of hundreds of years with the Pope, just to marry this woman. Historians still debate, did Henry truly love Anne passionately? Or was he only stimulated by her clever refusal? Whatever the answer. What is certain is that personal desire turned into a political earthquake, marking the beginning of the birth of the independent Church of England. If you ever had a date who deleted your number after just a few days because you didn't reply to messages, then imagine Henry patiently waiting 7 years. From one perspective, you have to admit he was indeed the VIP guest of the patience world. But sadly, this patience was not for love, but for an overthrow of an entire religion. Truly, love can move mountains. But in this case, it moved even the Pope. During that waiting period, Henry became increasingly unstable moods, fluctuating, anger easily bursting out, and the delusion that his will was God's will. Many observations show he believed that his desire for a woman was proof that God was directing him. A strange combination of lust and theology. In fact, if he lived today, Henry would probably be the type of person posting statuses, "God told me to do this," every time there was an excuse for a breakup. And then, in 1533, when Anne was pregnant, Henry declared divorce from Catherine, despite the opposition of all Europe. The Church of England was born. England left the embrace of Roman Catholicism. That was a momentous historical event. But its roots came from something seemingly very private, the desire for a male heir. The tragic part was, the child Anne gave birth to was a girl, Elizabeth. And you know, it was Elizabeth who later became one of the greatest queens of England. Truly, the paradox of history. What Henry was most disappointed in was exactly the greatest gift he left to the nation. For you, hearing this far, you may think Henry sounds more like a character in a television drama than a real king. But remember, everything was real. The affairs, the executions, the decisions that shook all of Europe, all originated from a heart or a head that knew no restraint. You listen to the gentle sound of the fan by your ear. I will take you further into the next tragic chapter of Henry VIII's life. After Anne Boleyn was executed in 1536 with accusations so absurd that even the judges blushed, Henry did not wait long to turn to a new flower, Jane Seymour. Jane was not like Anne. She was gentle, devout, knowing how to cool the king's anger with her meekness. People often said if Anne was a blazing fire, then Jane was a calm stream. Just a few months after Anne's death, Jane became queen. This is a historical event that many remember. Jane was the one who gave birth to Prince Edward, Henry's only hope for an heir. But do you know a detail rarely mentioned? Jane died only 12 days after giving birth. At just 29 years old, that death truly broke Henry's heart. Perhaps one of the rare times in his life when he showed genuine sorrow. Historians still debate, did Henry really love Jane the most among his wives? Or was it only because she gave him a son? Because later, when he died, Henry chose to be buried next to Jane in the royal vault, even though he had 3 more wives after her, seen through the eyes of the 21st century. You could see this as like pinning an ex's name on Facebook, to let the whole world know who was the first and the last love. After Jane, Henry continued the Queen's selection. This time, Politics stepped in strongly. He wanted an alliance with the German states against Roman Catholicism. So a royal matchmaking took place. And you know, matchmaking that relies only on a painting is full of risk. The portrait of Anne of Cleves, painted by Hans Holbein, was so beautiful that Henry believed he would meet a beauty, but when she arrived in England, the king immediately exclaimed that she was unlovable. The word unlovable here, if translated into the language of social media, would be picture, not like real person. The official event that marriage lasted only a few months, not reaching any ending before it was annulled. Anne became the dear sister of the king, and perhaps she was the luckiest woman among Henry's wives divorced, but kept her life, and lived comfortably until the end. A strange detail, little known after escaping Henry. Anne even attended Christmas parties with other queens, sitting and chatting happily, as if there had never been a failed marriage. You see, even in the cold-blooded Tudor world, there was still a bit of humour, like a side story. But don't think Henry learned a lesson. Right after that, he became involved with Catherine Howard, a girl only 15, while Henry was nearly 50, obese, and with a festering wound on his leg. Historians still debate whether Catherine truly committed adultery, or was just a victim of the power games in the Howard family. What is clear is, the girl became queen only to be executed a few years later, accused of betrayal. A chilling detail before the day of execution. Catherine practiced how to place her head on the block, like a student rehearsing for an exam. Just think, a teenage girl swept into the vortex of lust and politics, then ending in the cold of the scaffold. You may think, well, Henry was just a cruel man. But if you look deeper, you will see a more horrifying truth. He turned the whole society into a selection game, where noble girls were pushed into the court like pawns. Some families even trained their daughters to be just attractive enough to catch the king's eye, like parents today, registering their children for reality television shows. It sounds funny, but in Tudor times, that game could cost a life. And then, Catherine Howard was gone. Henry continued, for the last time, with Catherine Parr. She was not a beautiful young girl, but a mature widow, skillful and educated. One could say Catherine was more like a nurse, a mother, than a wife. She cared for Henry as he grew heavier, obese, short of breath, even needing a crane to be lifted onto a horse. An interesting detail, Catherine Parr was the only woman who survived Henry, and even remarried after the king's death. Truly final-level survival. Throughout that journey, you see, Henry's queens were like victims of a sorrowful cycle: marriage, endurance, disappointment, and if lucky then divorce, otherwise prison and the axe. What makes people shudder is that he never regretted, even on his sickbed, with ulcerated legs and heavy breathing, he still believed that everything he did was God's will. A bizarre combination of sexual obsession, absolute power, and twisted religious faith. What kind of modern character does Henry VIII resemble? A famous football star with enormous media power, but constantly caught in love scandals? Or a politician willing to rewrite laws to legalize private actions? In fact, Henry was both, plus the deadly power that no one dared resist. Just joking, if Henry lived today, he would surely trend on social media every week, and the tabloids would never run out of topics. You have followed me through Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, 6 wives, 6 fates, 6 tragedies revolving around one man. And the strangest thing of all, Henry's greatest legacy was not battles or economic reforms, but the scars in marriage, religion, and society. Historians still debate, did England truly benefit from breaking with the Pope? Or was it merely the accidental outcome of a personal obsession? Think about it. When you walk into Tudor castles today, looking at the portraits of forgotten queens, you will not only see splendid gowns, but also faint traces of trembling and fear of the girls once turned into pawns. And at the end of that long corridor, Henry still stands there, heavy, greedy, and full of darkness. Take a deep breath. Let me lead you away from the dark bedrooms of Henry VIII and look more broadly at English society at that time. Because his marriages, executions, or personal obsessions did not only kill a few queens, but also left cracks lasting centuries in politics, religion, and even the psychology of the people. The first official historical event you must remember in 1534, Henry officially cut ties with the Pope, declaring himself the supreme head of the Church of England. This was not only a romantic decision, but a turning point that changed all of Europe. It began the English Reformation, laying the foundation for a new religion that still exists today. Imagine, just because a king wanted to divorce his wife, an entire country changed its religion. It sounds like a sitcom script, but unfortunately, it was a real tragedy. A strange fact that few people know from that stubbornness: England gained a huge treasure. Henry dissolved Catholic monasteries, confiscated their lands and assets, turning them into massive resources to enrich the crown. Castles, mansions, and even a part of England's treasury, later all originated from that liquidation of God's house. Some historians humorously called Henry the greatest real estate dealer of the 16th century. But historians still debate, did England truly benefit from that turning point, or just fall into a new spiral of chaos? Because after Henry's death, his son Edward VI died young. Mary I restored Catholicism and then persecuted Protestants. And finally, Elizabeth I balanced everything. You see, a personal romantic decision pushed the whole country into nearly half a century of religious turmoil. If today you feel stressed just because your lover blocked you on Facebook, then try to put yourself in that time. The whole nation was blocked by the Vatican. Beyond religion, Henry also sowed a silent fear among the nobility. Remember Catherine Howard, a young girl brought into the court only because her family wanted to advance. From then on, English families began to be cautious. Marrying their daughters into the court could bring glory, but it could also be a death sentence. Therefore, many noble families chose to keep their daughters in the countryside, far from the king's gaze. This changed the structure of society. The Tudor court gradually lacked young noblewomen, and the value of each girl who caught the king's eye became even more exaggerated. You could call this the showbiz fever of the 16th century, only with one difference: if your career flopped, you didn't lose an advertising contract. You lost your head. Another strange detail in his later years: when Henry was so obese that he could not walk, he had to be lifted onto a horse by a pulley system. Yet, even as his body weakened, he still indulged in dreams of romantic conquest. There is an anecdote that he was so confident he believed he was still attractive in the eyes of young women, something that, from the outside, must have looked like a beer-bellied uncle trying to post youthful, filtered selfies. Funny as it may sound, behind it was an entire society forced to nod in approval, because who dared tell the truth? Looking deeper, you will see Henry distorted the entire legal system. The law of treason, originally meant to punish rebels, suddenly expanded to the point that if his wife committed adultery, or was even suspected of not being a virgin at marriage, it was enough reason for execution. Historians still debate that this was the most blatant abuse of legal power in English history. Imagine if today the law could be rewritten just because someone was heartbroken, The courts would be as crowded as a coffee shop on Monday morning. The international impact was not small. After Catherine of Aragon was abandoned, Spain, once an ally, and also Henry's mother-in-law's family, considered it an insult. Anglo-Spanish relations fractured for generations. When Henry bombed Anne of Cleves, the German lords also became furious. A string of failed marriages turned England into Europe's difficult neighbour. The image of England in foreign eyes was no different than a nation whose king liked to change wives like changing clothes. And now, look at his children. Mary, daughter with Catherine, grew up in bitterness because her mother was humiliated, and later became Bloody Mary, burning hundreds of Protestants alive. Elizabeth, daughter with Anne Boleyn, witnessed her mother beheaded as a child and grew up cautious, never marrying. Edward VI, the longed-for heir, died at just 15. All of them carried psychological scars, as if their father's bedroom tragedies were etched into the fate of an entire generation. You see, Henry not only destroyed marriages, but also sowed seeds of instability into every piece of society. An obese king with ulcerated legs, yet able to make all of Europe tremble, simply because he wanted to escape the boredom of his bedroom. Truly the greatest tragedy of history, when private desire became law, when the bed turned into a court, and when one man believed that his lust was God's will. You are sitting still, listening to the faint wind outside the window, while I will take you deeper into another layer of Henry VIII's legacy, the layer of culture, art, and collective memory. Because his sexual obsessions left marks not only in politics or religion, but also in the way the English viewed marriage, love, and power for hundreds of years. Let us begin with a prominent historical event. After breaking from the Pope, Henry issued a series of laws forcing his subjects to acknowledge the legitimacy of his marriages. If not, it was treason. Thomas More, the great statesman famous for his intellect and loyalty, refused to swear loyalty to Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn. The result? He was executed. This is a prime example of how one man's love life became national policy, and anyone who disagreed had to lose their head. Historians still debate, did Henry truly care about religion, or simply exploit it to serve personal desire? A strange detail, little known after Anne Boleyn was executed, Henry ordered the destruction or alteration of all queenly symbols on castle walls, objects, even in hymnals. The roses, the intertwined initials H and A, Henry and Anne, were chiseled away, replaced with new symbols for Jane Seymour, just like deleting all your ex's photos from your phone, but on a national scale, and the people had to pretend that Anne Boleyn had never existed. Think about it. That created a frightening habit. An entire society had to live in pretense, in silent complicity. Boots. Artists dared not write anything other than songs praising the king's current love. Literature about romantic love, once flourishing in England, suddenly withered, giving way to flattery and hymns to His Majesty's divine love. If today you ever had to write a status praising your boss to avoid trouble, then imagine the situation back then. Just one wrong line of poetry about love, and you could end up at the scaffold. That influence was also imprinted in painting. You may have seen the portraits of Henry VIII in splendid garments, standing tall like a mountain of flesh. That was not only art, but propaganda. Painters were forced to paint him as a symbol of strength, of abundant vitality, though in reality he was obese, in pain, and gasping for breath each time he climbed a few steps. A little joke, Henry could be considered the ancestor of using photo filters, but the most haunting part was not in paintings or poetry, but in folk memory. People whispered that Hampton Court Palace, his palace, was haunted by the screams of Catherine Howard on the night she ran through the corridor begging for her life. Or the Tower of London, where Anne Boleyn lost her head. Now a famous tourist attraction with chilling stories. This means the memory of those women destroyed lived not only in history books, but also became ghosts in the collective imagination of the English. You walk in, feel the icy air, and may whisper, "Surely they are still here." Never gone. Historians still debate whether those ghost stories are real, or just reflections of society's guilty conscience. But what is clear is that the English, even now, have not completely escaped Henry's legacy. Just hearing the rhyme divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Children in England can recite by heart the names of Henry's 6 wives. That is how collective memory turned tragedies into a nursery rhyme game. Bitter indeed, but also so English. Now look broader, the cultural and social consequences. After Henry's reign, queens, being seen as tools for bearing sons, cast a long shadow. Noble women understood that their status depended entirely on their ability to reproduce. Families were fearful, wanting advancement, but also afraid their daughters would become sacrifices. The result was a culture both greedy and trembling, where women were turned into commodities of exchange, and men learned that power was measured by the fates of women in their hands. There is an interesting detail. Many researchers believe Queen Elizabeth I's choice of remaining single, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, stemmed from her having witnessed too clearly the fates of the women around Henry. Elizabeth became the Virgin Queen, declaring she was married to England. This can be seen as a direct reaction, a resistance to her father's legacy. You see, Henry wanted a prince, but in the end, it was the very daughters he once despised who ruled and raised England to greatness. History truly knows how to be ironic. If you looked at Europe then, you would see people calling England the kingdom of the amorous king and short-lived queens. Foreign envoys wrote home in horror. Each trip to England was like attending a bloody play, where today was a wedding feast, tomorrow, already, an execution. England's international reputation was severely damaged, and it took centuries to wash away that image. I know. By now you may be smiling lightly, thinking Henry was like a character in a long-running television series, with each season changing the female lead. But behind that laughter lies a dark truth. Hundreds of people died, thousands of families were implicated, and an entire country was turned into a courtroom for one man's love affairs. Do you still hear your heartbeat slowing with each detail? If so, don't worry. Tonight, when you turn off the lights, remember that Tudor castles are now only tourist sites. Those ghosts, only legends. But the lesson remains: when personal lust combines with absolute power, an entire society will be reshaped. And sometimes, the price paid is not just a few lives, but an entire culture. You shift slightly, hear the wind outside seeping through the curtain, and I will take you further this time, no longer the romances or velvet beds of Henry VIII, but the political aftershocks he left, for his most dangerous legacy lay not only in the beheaded queens, but in the path he opened that plunged England into centuries of unrest. First, to remember this important historical event, the Act of Supremacy in 1534. This was the document officially cutting ties between England and the Pope, placing Henry in the position of supreme head of the Church of England. From then on, no pope had the right to intervene in his marriages. It sounded like a unilateral contract termination, but the consequence was an entire nation separating from Europe's largest religious network. Historians still debate, was this decision the first step toward England becoming a modern nation, or just a historical accident fueled by personal lust? A strange fact few noticed to consolidate power after breaking with the Pope. Henry dissolved hundreds of monasteries, confiscating their lands and wealth. The fortune was so immense that the royal treasury suddenly swelled. But this also destroyed a medieval social welfare system, where monasteries once cared for the poor, the sick, and orphans. Imagine waking up one morning to find all public hospitals and free schools across the country shut down, simply because the king needed money and land to reward his courtiers. Truly, a Tudor economic shock. From there, England entered a bloody political spiral. After Henry, his 3 children in succession took the throne: Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. Each pulled the country in a different religious direction. Edward continued Protestant reforms. Mary reversed them to restore Catholicism and burned hundreds of Protestants. And finally, Elizabeth tried to balance everything to avoid civil war. You see, one decision of Henry's sowed the seeds for nearly half a century of chaos. And then, when you look further, you see an even longer-lasting consequence: the birth of the idea that the king could stand above the law. Henry rewrote laws to serve his private life. From then on, people began to doubt, was the law truly fair, or merely a cloak hiding the ambitions of the ruler? Historians still debate that this very doubt, accumulated over generations, contributed to the atmosphere of discontent that led to the English Civil War in the 17th century. Another interesting detail: Henry VIII not only sowed instability in religion and law, but also changed the perception of royal marriage. Before that, marriages between European royal families were seen as crucial diplomatic tools. But since Henry repeatedly changed wives like changing clothes, European princesses became wary of marrying into England. Think about it: who would want to sign a marriage contract with a partner who had a habit of executing when bored? This made England gradually become isolated and had to find its own political path instead of relying on marriage alliances as before. Strangely, even though Henry caused chaos, those very cracks paved the way for change. When the people and nobility grew tired of the king getting whatever he wanted by rewriting the law, they began to wonder, why not limit the king's power? This idea quietly spread, and then, a century later, erupted in the English Civil War, where King Charles I was put on trial and executed. From there, the constitutional monarchy began to take shape. It can be said that if Henry had not abused his power so severely, England might not have embarked on the path toward democratization so early. And this is the irony of history: Henry VIII, the man who used power to legitimize his desires, accidentally became the one who triggered the process of limiting royal authority, as if he pushed the pendulum so far to one extreme that society had no choice but to pull it back for balance. Does that sound familiar? Like someone who eats too many sweets until their body is forced to impose a lifelong sugar-free diet. When you look at the Tudor castles today, you don't just see magnificent architecture, but also the silhouette of an England learning a bitter lesson: never let one man turn private lust into public policy. And if you notice, even the later kings and queens, from Elizabeth I to the Stuarts and the modern Windsors, all live under that shadow. Every royal marriage is scrutinized, as if the public always remains wary. Will there be another Henry VIII? You see, what seemed like private sexual obsessions in a king's bedroom ended up redrawing Europe's political map, shaping democratic thought, and imprinting themselves in the cultural memory of the English people to this day. Imagine, when Henry VIII closed the curtain on his stormy life, he left behind not only a vacancy on the throne, but also in the hearts of his children. Each of them bore a psychological scar, etched by their father's marital tragedies. And if Elizabeth was the golden light at the end of the Tudor era, then Mary, his eldest daughter with Catherine of Aragon, was the haunting shadow, a living testament to the cost of power and desire, From a young age, Mary witnessed her mother, Catherine, being publicly humiliated by Henry. She was a woman once respected by all of England, yet after 24 years of marriage, she was treated as an outdated wife, simply for not bearing a son. Mary was so attached to her mother that when Henry forced her to recognize his marriage to Anne Boleyn, the young girl refused. From that moment, Mary was no longer Princess of England, but was reduced to an outsider. This is the natural transition from Henry, the man who rewrote laws to satisfy his desires, to Mary, the child who had to live under those very laws, becoming a direct victim of familial cruelty. An official historical event, Mary was stripped of her princess title, called Lady Mary, and forced to leave her mother. Worse still, she was forbidden from seeing Catherine until her mother's death. Imagine the scene of a daughter not being able to see her mother one last time. That trauma haunted Mary for life. A strange detail few know Mary. Once a smart girl, talented in music and fluent in Latin, French, and Spanish, was once considered a treasure by European courts. But after the family crisis, she became a sickly young woman, often plagued by stomach, pain, and depression. Some records say Mary cried so much, her eyes stayed swollen for days. If she lived today, doctors would likely diagnose her with chronic severe stress. Historians still debate, was it shame and a tragic childhood that turned Mary into the Bloody Mary of later years? Or was she naturally a strong-willed person, just waiting for her moment? Regardless of the answer, when she ascended the throne in 1553, years of suppressed resentment erupted into a storm. Mary believed it was her sacred duty to restore Catholicism in England. She ordered hundreds of Protestants to be burned alive, giving rise to the name Bloody Mary in history. And remember, the root of her fanaticism did not lie purely in faith, but began in a childhood where her father had turned love into a political game. Think about it, if Henry VIII had not humiliated Catherine, had not turned Mary into an outcast, perhaps she would not have burned with such desire to avenge her mother and restore Catholic faith. Here, Mary's fate resembles a mirror, what her father sowed with lust and violence. She reaped with fire and blood, and ironically, Mary died without leaving an heir. The Tudor dynasty then shone under Elizabeth, the daughter whom Henry once scorned for not being a boy. History does love its jokes, doesn't it? Lean back gently in your chair, and let me take you deeper into the story. This time it's Elizabeth, Mary's half-sister. If Mary was the heavy night, then Elizabeth was the radiant dawn. Though both emerged from the same tragic household, while Mary lived with the pain of seeing her mother scorned, Elizabeth, Henry's daughter with Anne Boleyn, suffered a different tragedy. At just 3 years old, she lost her mother, not to illness, but to the executioner's blade. Anne Boleyn was beheaded on charges of adultery, and Elizabeth went from being a princess to a bastard child. Imagine that childhood like a child being erased from the family registry in a single morning, never again allowed to call her mother's name with pride. This is the natural shift from Mary, who grew up bitter over her mother's humiliation, to Elizabeth, who matured haunted by her mother's execution. Both shared the same family trauma, but turned it into two opposite paths. An important historical event: Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1558, after Mary's death. At the time, England was exhausted from religious persecution, economically strained, and diplomatically isolated. Yet Elizabeth turned the tide, ushering in the Elizabethan Golden Age. She adopted a policy of religious moderation, allowing both Catholicism and Protestantism to coexist within limits. Yes, and more importantly, she decided not to marry, declaring herself the Virgin Queen. A strange detail few notice: Elizabeth had many rumoured romances, the most famous being with Robert Dudley. but she always kept her distance, never allowing anyone to become the husband of the Queen. Some say she feared marriage, because the memory of her parents taught her a deep lesson: love can turn into a death sentence. Others believe she was wise, using the image of a virgin to strengthen her political power, turning herself into the faithful wife of England. Historians still debate, was Elizabeth truly single out of principle, or because of emotional scars? Whatever the reason, the result is clear. Elizabeth became one of the greatest queens in Europe. During her reign, England defeated the mighty Spanish Armada in 1588. Marking the beginning of maritime expansion, English culture flourished. The age of Shakespeare emerged, leaving a golden legacy in human history. And you see, the very daughter Henry, once resented for not being a boy, became the one to lead England to greatness. Imagine, in Elizabeth's mind were always two ghosts: her mother, Anne Boleyn, who lost her head for alleged betrayal, and her sister Mary, remembered by history as bloody. Elizabeth chose a different path: not to be a wife, not to be a mother, but to be the queen of the entire nation. She turned wounds into strength, loneliness into a halo. At this point, you'll realize a bitter irony. Henry VIII, a man who spent his life craving a prince, ultimately left his brightest legacy thanks to his two daughters. Mary, with all her pain, revealed the dark side of power and hatred. Elizabeth, with her resilience and intellect, proved that even within tragedy, a proud flower could bloom. Picture this: a little girl, just 3 years old, not yet able to understand her mother's love, already had it taken from her. The day Anne Boleyn walked to the scaffold at the Tower of London, Elizabeth was transformed from princess to illegitimate child. From then on, her childhood was spent on the sidelines, surviving by the grace of Catherine Parr, Henry's last wife, or under the wary gaze of the court. But it was this unstable childhood that forged Elizabeth into a woman who knew how to observe, when to stay silent, and when to speak up. A key historical event, when her sister Mary I took the throne, Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower of London for allegedly being involved in Wyatt's rebellion. With just a bit of bad luck, she could have followed her mother to the executioner's block, but Elizabeth survived thanks to her cleverness, knowing how to deny while preserving her dignity. Imagine, at just 20, already playing a life-or-death political game. Not everyone could possess such fortitude. A strange detail few people know during her imprisonment: Elizabeth often wrote letters in lemon juice, meaning the writing only appeared when heated by fire. That was how she secretly communicated with her supporters. A young girl, locked in cold stone walls, still found a way to make her voice heard. If she lived today, she'd probably master the use of self-destructing messages on chat apps. Then, when Mary died in 1558, Elizabeth ascended the throne amid much doubt. After all, she was both Anne Boleyn's daughter and the child her father had declared a bastard. Historians still debate, was Elizabeth confident from the beginning? Or did she have to steel herself to hide her fear? But whatever the case, history proved she became one of the most outstanding leaders. Elizabeth's reign is associated with the name Golden Age. She restored religious peace through the Elizabethan settlement, preventing England from falling into mutual slaughter like under Mary's rule. She built the image of a single queen, skillfully rejecting all political marriages to avoid being bound. People called her the Virgin Queen. Behind that title was a whole strategy, turning solitude into a symbol, turning belonging to no one into the strength to belong to an entire people. Another major event in 1588. Elizabeth faced a life-or-death challenge when the Spanish Armada, the most powerful military force in Europe, attacked England. She went to Tilbury, donned armor, rode a horse, and told her soldiers the famous words, "I know. I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England." You can picture the scene: sea winds whipping through flags, soldiers roaring, and at the centre of it all, a small but steadfast woman. That was the moment Elizabeth became a legend. The result: the Spanish Armada was defeated, and England entered an age of maritime expansion. It was under her reign that voyages by Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh paved the way for the powerful empire to come. Let your body relax. Close your eyes for a moment, and let me take you to the final years of Elizabeth I, the woman who turned England into a glorious dynasty, yet lived and died in aching solitude. This story is long, slow, like the last candle flickering in a cold room, shining and trembling just before it goes out. Fading signs Elizabeth reigned for over 4 decades. She ascended the throne in 1558 at the age of 25, young, graceful, and full of vitality. But by the 1592nd, when she was over 60, a very high number for Tudor-era life expectancy, she began to weaken. The signs of aging made Elizabeth, who once wielded her image as a political weapon, feel insecure. She lost many teeth, and her breath was heavy with odour. Her skin darkened with wrinkles, but Elizabeth never let anyone see clearly. She used thick layers of white lead makeup to hide her flaws. That type of makeup was actually toxic, and the more she used it, the more it damaged her skin. Many historians believe this habit contributed to her rapid exhaustion. Compared to today, it's like an aging celebrity overusing filters until they no longer recognize themselves once they're removed. But Elizabeth could not stop, because the image of the immortal Virgin Queen had to be maintained until the very end. If she showed signs of aging, factions within the court would immediately see it as a sign of political weakness. So every time she appeared in public, she applied heavy makeup, wore bright red wigs, and dressed in gowns laden with gold thread. It's said that Elizabeth would sit for hours just for the portrait artist to adjust every detail, ensuring her image remained forever that of the ageless woman. Loneliness in the palace. The older Elizabeth grew, the lonelier she became. Without husband or children, she had only a few close courtiers. Robert Dudley, the only man she may have truly loved, died in 1588. After that, she had no truly lasting romantic relationships. In her final years, her closest companion was Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, a young, handsome, and impulsive man. Essex was like a late substitute for Dudley, but the relationship ended tragically in 1601. Essex rebelled against her, and Elizabeth was forced to sign his death warrant. Some say she cried the entire time she signed it, and never overcame the trauma of executing someone she loved. It was a deep psychological blow that pushed her further into emotional darkness. A little-known detail after Essex's death: Elizabeth forbade anyone from mentioning his name in the palace. But in her private chamber, she kept a ring he had once given her. At night, servants would see her silently stare at it for hours. Truly, even a queen could not escape the pain of love. Physical and mental decline. At the end of her life, Elizabeth suffered from many ailments: joint pain, difficulty breathing, and chronic insomnia. She would often stand for hours in her room, refusing to lie down. When attendants begged her to rest, she said, "If I lie down, I will never get up again." That statement sounded like a prophecy, and indeed, in her final days, she stood so much that her legs swelled, and she had to lean on cushions. Historians still debate, why did Elizabeth refuse to sleep? Some believe she feared nightmares, because in her dreams, she saw her mother, Anne Boleyn, walking headless in the Tower of London. Others think she feared that if she dozed off, the court would immediately scheme to name her successor. Whatever the reason, that anxiety turned her final nights into an exhausting ordeal. One strange detail: Elizabeth was terrified of mirrors. In the palace, she had them all covered, allowing no one to look into them, because in the mirror, she saw an old face, far from the immortal queen image she had created. That fear made her like an aging star, trying to escape time, but ultimately unable to. Final decisions. In 1603, Elizabeth was too weak. The nation began to worry about succession. She had no children, and the most legitimate heir was James VI of Scotland, the grandson of Henry VIII's sister. This was a significant transition under James. England and Scotland would unite. Elizabeth never officially announced it in writing, but under pressure from the court, she gave a faint nod of approval. Historians still debate, did she truly want James to succeed? Or was she simply too tired to resist? Regardless, that decision opened the Stuart dynasty, ending the Tudor line. An interesting but rarely mentioned detail before her death: Elizabeth wore a long white gown. No jewellery. No crown. She sat on the floor, leaning on cushions, as if trying to shed all royal burdens and return to being just a human. That image was so haunting that many servants later recalled it with trembling voices. A lasting figure today. When you step into Hampton Court Palace or the Tower of London, you may hear whispers of stories about Elizabeth. In Westminster Abbey, her tomb lies beside Mary, the elder sister who was once her adversary. The two sisters, who once stood on opposite sides, now rest beside each other in silence. On their tombstone is engraved "Partners in hope of the resurrection." Here they rest. A conclusion both ironic and tender. Imagine, in the darkness of the cathedral, Elizabeth is no longer the Virgin Queen or the conqueror of the Spanish Armada, but simply a human being, carrying loneliness, unfinished loves, and a heart worn out after 4 decades of bearing a nation. Thus, from a child labelled illegitimate, Elizabeth became a radiant symbol of a whole people. She lived in solitude but died in glory. And if you listen carefully, amid the night wind, perhaps you can still hear her whisper, "I belong to no man. I belong to England." Elizabeth in literature and art, even during her lifetime, Elizabeth understood the value of art in shaping her image. She encouraged portraits that depicted her as the eternal queen, not old, not weak, but always youthful, proud, and with eyes shining like fire. Famous paintings like the Armada portrait painted after the defeat of the Spanish Armada turned her into a symbol of a nation victorious at sea. In it, Elizabeth's hand rests on a globe, an image suggesting that she not only ruled England but looked outward to the world. A little-known fact: official portraits of Elizabeth were strictly controlled. Artists who painted her looking old or tired could be banned from their profession. In other words, Elizabeth knew how to manage her personal brand since the 16th century. If she lived today, she would surely be an Instagram master, with a team of filter experts following her 24/7. In literature, the Elizabethan reign. In literature, Elizabeth's reign is called the Golden Age, where Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Spenser composed their works. Shakespeare once wrote A Midsummer Night's Dream, with a passage believed to subtly praise Elizabeth as the goddess Diana, a virgin yet powerful. Historians still debate, did Shakespeare truly allude to the Queen, or merely borrow the image to avoid trouble? Either way, the literature of the time helped reinforce Elizabeth's image as both a real and mythical figure. Image in folk memory beyond. The magnificent portraits in folk tales. Elizabeth was also woven into legend. Some say her spirit appears at Richmond Palace, where she died, wearing a flowing white gown. Others claim to hear her footsteps in the halls of Windsor Castle. These stories show that Elizabeth was not only a queen, but also an eternal ghost of England, both haunting and admirable. In particular, the image of the Virgin Queen became one of the strongest symbols of English culture. It was praised as independence, but also mocked as loneliness. Among the people, songs praised Elizabeth as the faithful wife of England, yet there were also satirical plays quietly portraying her as an aging woman avoiding marriage. These dualities coexisted, making her image even more complex. Elizabeth in modern memory, stepping into the 20th and 21st centuries. Elizabeth I became a familiar figure in film and novels. She appeared in Elizabeth 1998 and Elizabeth the Golden Age, 2007, portrayed by Kate Blanchett, turning her into a powerful cinematic icon, both radiant and fragile. The scene where she dons armor and rides a horse to rally troops before the Battle of Tilbury has been reenacted dozens of times as one of the most glorious moments in European history. An interesting detail in British public polls: Elizabeth I frequently ranks among the greatest leaders in history. People remember her not because she was the Virgin Queen, but because she brought stability, confidence, and pride to England. On the other hand, the modern scholars still debate, was the image of the immortal Queen true, or merely a facade? Some researchers believe Elizabeth was actually lonely to the point of despair, and the title Virgin Queen was just a political trick. Others believe she truly chose that life, viewing the throne as her only love. It is precisely this ambiguity that keeps Elizabeth fascinating. No one can say for sure whether she was a happy or tragic woman. The remaining presence today. Today, when you come to London and pass through Westminster Abbey, you will see Elizabeth's tomb placed right next to her sister Mary. The tombstone bears the inscription, "Partners in throne and grave. Here we sleep. Sisters, in hope of resurrection." A strange arrangement. Two sisters once at odds, now lie side by side, as if history has reconciled them. At Hampton Court Palace, where Elizabeth once lived, rooms with deep red walls still remain. Visitors say they feel her presence, especially in the long corridors where light filters through narrow windows. The Tower of London, where her mother lost her head, is now a tourist site, but many still claim to hear Anne Boleyn's sighs. And somewhere, Elizabeth's presence lingers, like a child searching for her mother. In popular culture, Elizabeth's image is often used as a symbol of feminism, a woman who dared to refuse marriage, dared to stand firm in a man's world, and dared to turn loneliness into a weapon. But simultaneously, there are perspectives suggesting she was merely a victim of the past, a woman who never truly got to be herself. You see, the life of Elizabeth I resembles a great play in 3 acts: a rejected childhood, a glorious reign, and a lonely final chapter. But the play didn't end when she closed her eyes. It continues in paintings, in Shakespearean drama, in films, and in the memories of visitors walking through Tudor castles. If Henry VIII left his mark with brutality and desire, Elizabeth left her legacy with wisdom, intelligence, and personal sacrifice. Ironically, the very daughter he once scorned for not being a boy became the brightest jewel of the Tudor dynasty. Close your eyes and imagine yourself walking in Westminster Abbey, slowly approaching Elizabeth's tomb. No more crown, no more power, only a name etched in stone. But the light through the cathedral window shines down, as if to remind us sometimes one can live forever, not in body, but in the memory of an entire nation. Do you remember we just spoke of history's irony? The father famed for cruelty, the daughter becoming a legend. From that paradox, Let's move to another equally intriguing aspect, the personal life. The everyday secrets of Elizabeth, where power meets the mundane. Because sometimes it is the smallest details that make her feel closest, letting us see she was not only the Virgin Queen, but also a flesh and blood human being, with preferences, fears, and peculiar habits. Fashion as a political weapon. Elizabeth was famous for owning the most lavish wardrobe in Europe. It was said she had thousands of dresses, each weighing dozens of kilograms, adorned with pearls and jewels. But behind this luxury was a strategy. She used fashion to assert power. Whenever she appeared, Elizabeth often wore white dresses, symbolizing purity, and pearls, a symbol of virginity. This was not merely a preference, but a way for her to build the image of an untouchable queen. Historians still debate, did she truly want to remain single all her life? Or was she simply using the symbol as political armor? A little-known detail, Elizabeth once banned courtiers from wearing overly bright colors when presenting themselves because she wanted to be the most radiant figure in the scene. Imagine the entire court in pale grey. And at the center stood Elizabeth, glowing like the sun. You'll understand why the people called her Gloriana, the Glorious One. Eating habits at meals. Elizabeth greatly enjoyed venison, pheasant, and especially sweets. Perhaps because of this, her teeth deteriorated severely, and by the end of her life, she had lost many. Servants recounted that when speaking closely, her breath was rather unpleasant. But Elizabeth, always refined, would chew herbs or drink wine mixed with honey to mask it. If she lived today, she would probably always carry a box of mints in her royal handbag. Pastimes and entertainment beyond politics. Elizabeth loved music, and especially dancing. It is said that even in her 52nd, she could dance for hours at banquets. Another form of entertainment she loved was watching plays. Shakespeare performed many works directly in front of Elizabeth, and she often generously rewarded the troops. One anecdote tells that during a performance of Much Ado About Nothing, Elizabeth laughed so hard that she cried, astonishing the entire court. This shows that behind the political coldness, she still had a soul that loved to laugh. Relationship with her subjects. Elizabeth was very skilled in engaging with the people. She often visited the countryside so the people could see their queen in person. These journeys were not just ceremonial, but a way to reinforce her image as the mother of the nation. The people often offered flowers, shouted blessings, and Elizabeth responded with gentle smiles, sometimes even delivering a light-hearted quip that made the crowd burst into laughter. That is why, when she died, the people mourned and affectionately called her Good Queen Bess. From those small details, we see that Elizabeth was not just a dry historical figure, but a vibrant person, who knew how to enjoy, how to conceal, and how to turn everyday life into political tools. But even that is not enough. What made her truly special was her ability to turn solitude into strength. A woman with no husband, nor children, who left behind a legacy more brilliant than any king before her. And to understand that more clearly, let's look at how she managed her image and power until the final years of her life. A carefully controlled image, Elizabeth understood clearly that power didn't just lie in swords and thrones, but in how people saw her. Therefore, all official portraits had to be approved. If any portrayed her as too old or lacking dignity, it was immediately banned. She carefully selected symbols, white dresses, strings of pearls, globes, her hand placed on a scepter. All of it was visual language, much like modern brand logos. A little-known fact, there were secret portraits that depicted Elizabeth as aged and wrinkled, but nearly all were destroyed. She did not want her subjects to see that harsh truth. You see, even before Photoshop. Elizabeth already knew how to curate her image to protect her personal brand. The Virgin Queen symbol Elizabeth turned her unmarried status into a political tool. If a queen married, power would be shared with her husband. But by declaring herself the Virgin Queen, she made herself the wife of England. It was an extremely bold brand, positioning she belonged to no one, but to the entire nation. Historians still debate, did Elizabeth truly remain absolutely single? Or did she merely conceal secret romances? Whatever the case, the important thing is that the image of the Virgin Queen became legendary. It allowed her to maintain independence, making both her court and foreign powers cautious, unable to pull her into political marriages. Knowing how to perform power, Elizabeth didn't just stay inside her palace. She regularly organized royal progresses, journeys through the English countryside. She rode horses, shook hands, and accepted flowers from villagers. These images resembled modern election campaigns, bringing the Queen's image directly to her people, making her a part of their everyday lives. There's an anecdote: once, villagers offered her a pie as big as a table. Elizabeth laughed heartily and cut a piece to eat right in front of everyone. That gesture made the crowd cheer, seeing her as someone close, not just a distant symbol. Sounds a bit like a medieval mukbang live stream, doesn't it? Knowing when to speak and when to stay, silent Elizabeth was famous for her eloquence. Her speech at Tilbury in 1588, when she wore armor on horseback and told the soldiers, "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king," became legendary. With just a few lines, she turned fear of the Spanish Armada into courage, but she was also a master of silence. When pressured by courtiers to name a successor, Elizabeth skillfully avoided the topic. She knew that naming someone too early could incite that person's faction to undermine her. That very act of saying less helped her keep the throne longer. Today, we might call that information control strategy. A paradoxical legacy. Elizabeth lived her whole life as the leading actress on a grand stage. In public, she was the Virgin Queen, radiant, eternal, embodying England's strength and pride. But behind the curtain, she was a lonely woman, unmarried, childless, sometimes sitting for hours, staring into the dark. Historians still debate, was she happy with her choices? Did she truly believe she was doing what was right for her people? Or was she hiding a longing for love that history would not allow? Regardless, Elizabeth proved one thing: you don't need a man to be great. You can stand alone and still shake the world. Resting in memory. When Elizabeth died in 1603, all of England mourned, but gradually, the sorrow turned into memory, into legend. Her tomb was placed beside Mary, the elder sister she once opposed, as a late reconciliation. On the tombstone, it is inscribed that they are sisters in the hope of resurrection. A gentle ending for two fates shaped by the cruelty of the same father. Today, if you visit Westminster Abbey and stand before Elizabeth's tomb, you'll feel an eerie sense of peace. Soft rays of light fall on the stone, giving the impression that she is still there, quietly smiling. And in that smile, perhaps she is saying, "I lived fully, and now I rest." As you listen to this now, I believe you felt something personal too. Maybe it's the lesson that power and glory cannot erase loneliness. Maybe it's comfort, knowing that no matter how dark your beginnings, you can still rewrite your destiny. Or maybe it's simply a reminder that all people, whether kings or commoners, need love and empathy. Elizabeth spent her whole life hiding her vulnerability, turning solitude into a weapon. But you, fortunately, don't have to live that way. You can relax. Let your loved ones know you need them. And tonight, we have a truly peaceful sleep. So we've come full circle from a rejected child to a glorious queen, and then back to a fragile human being in the final years of life. Elizabeth's story is like a long piece of music at times, majestic, at times sorrowful, and finally fading into silence. Now, let your mind settle too. Let the noise of the day dissolve like distant drums of war. Let your worries fall away like the heavy layers of gowns Elizabeth once wore. You don't need a crown. You don't need a throne. All you need right now is a soft pillow, steady breathing, and peace seeping into every strand of your hair. Close your eyes. Imagine yourself walking through ancient hallways where candlelight gently fades, leaving behind a tender, safe space. Footsteps grow distant. The wooden door closes, and it's just you and sleep, wishing you a deep, peaceful night, as if Elizabeth herself is smiling and blessing you from afar. Tomorrow, when you wake, you'll feel lighter, stronger, as if you've learned a bit of resilience from the woman who once carried a whole kingdom on her slender shoulders. Sleep well.